And what do you do when you walk into your own living room and find your wife in another man's arms? Most people scream. Most people break something. Marcus Wilson did neither. He took one photograph. He turned around, and he walked out the front door without saying a single word. What he did in the silence that followed would take him 5 years to finish, and it would end with his wife losing everything she thought she'd won. My name is Marcus Wilson, and 3 years ago, I thought I had the kind of life other people envied. I want to tell you about that life before I tell you how it fell apart, because you need to understand what we looked like from the outside. You need to understand what Natalie and I built, so you can understand exactly what it cost to lose it. We met at a company conference 11 years ago. I was a rising analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, the kind of guy who color-coded his spreadsheets for fun. Natalie worked in marketing for a different company on the same floor of the same conference hotel. She laughed at my terrible jokes. She still laughed at them 9 years into our marriage, or at least I thought she did. We got married in a small ceremony by a lake. Her mother cried. My father, a man who almost never showed emotion, hugged me for a full 10 seconds and told me he was proud. We bought a house 2 years later, nothing extravagant, just a modest 3-bedroom with a crooked oak tree in the backyard that Natalie loved for reasons I never fully understood. She said it had character. I said it needed to be cut down before it fell on the garage. We never did agree on that tree, but we agreed on almost everything else. I built my career slowly and carefully. By year 8 of our marriage, I had become a senior financial analyst, trusted with accounts worth more money than I could really wrap my head around. I was good at my job. I was meticulous. I double-checked everything because that's who I am. That habit, as it turned out, would matter more than I ever imagined. Natalie and I had a rhythm. Sunday mornings were pancakes and bad reality television. Friday nights were her choice of restaurant, always. I worked long hours, but I made sure to be home for dinner at least 4 nights a week. We talked about having kids in a year or two, a phrase that somehow stretched across most of a decade without either of us minding much. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet contentment. If you had asked me back then to rate my marriage on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have said 9, and meant it. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't naive. I knew every marriage has friction. Natalie sometimes accused me of loving my job more than I loved coming home. I sometimes accused her of spending too much on things we didn't need. But these were the ordinary disagreements of 2 people who had built a life together and intended to keep building it. Then, 14 months before the night that changed everything, my career took a hit I never saw coming. A discrepancy surfaced in one of the accounts I managed. Money that should have been there wasn't. An internal audit was launched. My name was attached to the account, which meant my name was attached to the missing funds. I want to be clear, I hadn't done anything wrong. I would later prove that beyond any doubt. But in the moment, all anyone saw was my signature on the paperwork and a 6-figure gap that needed an explanation. The firm didn't wait for a full investigation before they acted. Within 3 weeks, I was placed on leave. Within 2 months, I was let go entirely, officially for restructuring, but everyone in the industry knew what that meant. My reputation, the thing I had spent a decade building one careful decision at a time, was in ruins. Other firms wouldn't return my calls. A rumor is a hard thing to outrun in a small industry, and mine had a head start. Natalie was supportive at first. She told me she believed in me. She told me we would get through it together, the way we'd gotten through everything else. I remember her holding my hand across the kitchen table the night I got the termination call, telling me it didn't change how she saw me. I believed her. I spent the following months trying to rebuild. I took contract work far below my qualifications, just to keep money coming in while I fought to clear my name through the proper channels, filing complaints, gathering documentation, doing everything by the book because that's who I've always been. It was slow, it was humiliating some days, but I kept at it because I knew the truth was on my side, even if nobody else did yet. What I didn't notice, because I was so focused on rebuilding, was that Natalie had started pulling away. She started working later. She started taking calls in the other room, phone pressed close to her ear, voice dropping the moment I walked in. She started saying things like, "You've changed," and "You're not the man I married," in a tone couldn't I quite place at the time. I told myself it was stress. I told myself she was scared about our finances, and who could blame her? I told myself a lot of things because the alternative was harder to look at directly. One evening, about 4 months before everything came apart, I came home early from a contract job that had wrapped ahead of schedule. Natalie wasn't expecting me. When I walked through the door, she was standing in the kitchen on the phone. And the second she saw me, her whole posture changed. She ended the call so fast I heard the beep cut her off mid-sentence. "Who was that?" I asked, not even suspicious yet, just making conversation. "Work," she said, too quickly, too smooth. I let it go. I let a lot of things go that year, because I had enough on my plate trying to prove I wasn't the failure everyone at my old firm believed me to be. I didn't have room left to wonder if my own house was hiding something too. But that night stayed with me. Not because of what she said, because of the look on her face in the half-second before she composed herself. A look I would only understand months later, once I finally saw the whole picture. Looking back now, I can see the pattern so clearly it almost embarrasses me. But when you're living inside a marriage, you don't get the luxury of hindsight. You only get today, and today rarely announces itself as the beginning of the end. The first real crack came with her phone. Natalie had never been secretive about her phone before. For years, if it buzzed on the counter, either of us would glance at it without a second thought. That changed sometime after the incident, with the phone call in the kitchen. She started carrying it into the bathroom. She started keeping it face down on the nightstand, which she had never done in 9 years of marriage. And one Tuesday morning, I noticed she had changed her passcode. I didn't say anything. I told myself people change habits for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with betrayal. Maybe she was hiding a surprise for my birthday. Maybe she was job hunting secretly and didn't want to jinx it. I built a dozen innocent explanations in my head, because the guilty one was too heavy to hold. Then came the late nights. Natalie had always kept regular hours at her marketing job, home by 6:30 at the latest, unless there was a launch event a few times a year. Starting that spring, working late became a weekly occurrence, then a twice-weekly occurrence. She'd come home around 9, sometimes later, offering vague explanations about a difficult client or a reorganized team that never quite added up when I paid attention to the details. I want to pause here and say something important. I wasn't tracking her. I wasn't checking up on her like a detective. I was a husband trying to notice his own life, the way anyone would. And the things I noticed kept accumulating in a way that was getting harder to file under coincidence. There was the new perfume, a scent I didn't recognize, sitting on her side of the bathroom counter next to the one she'd worn for years. When I asked about it, she laughed it off. "Oh, a friend recommended it. I picked it up at the mall." But the answer came a beat too fast, the way answers do when they've been rehearsed. There was the way she reacted when my old colleague, David Reyes, came up in conversation. David had worked alongside me at the firm for 6 years. We used to have him and his wife over for dinner. After my termination, David had stopped returning my calls almost entirely, which stung. But I chalked it up to the awkwardness of watching a friend's career implode. What I noticed, though, was that whenever his name came up around Natalie, she went quiet in a very specific way. Not sad quiet, not sympathetic quiet, but careful quiet, like she was choosing every word before she said it. I started doubting myself more than I doubted her. That's the part nobody tells you about this stage. You don't leap straight to suspicion. You spend weeks accusing yourself of being paranoid, of projecting your own insecurities from losing your job onto an innocent marriage. Natalie, for her part, seemed to sense the tension and would occasionally soften, a hand on my shoulder, a "we're okay, right?" that I clung to like a life raft. Those moments of warmth were enough to keep me from asking the harder questions. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want to know the answer. But the clues kept stacking. I noticed she'd started going to the gym more, a gym she'd never mentioned before, with hours that never quite lined up when I glanced at the receipts. I noticed she'd started dressing differently for her work events, more care, more attention, a version of effort I hadn't seen directed at anything involving me in a long time. I noticed that her tone with me had shifted from warmth to a kind of clipped patience, the tone you use with someone you're trying to manage, rather than someone you're building a life with. One night, she came home a full 2 hours later than usual, hair slightly damp, claiming she'd had to shower at the gym because the AC broke at home. Our AC had never broken. I checked the maintenance log the next morning out of some instinct I couldn't name, and there was no record of any issue, no call to the building service line, nothing. I sat with that fact for 3 days before I said anything. When I finally brought it up, gently, not accusing her of anything, just asking why the story didn't add up, Natalie's reaction told me more than any answer could have. She didn't get confused. She didn't get curious about why I'd checked the maintenance log. She got angry. Fast, sharp, disproportionate anger. The kind that exists to shut a conversation down before it can go anywhere dangerous. "Are you seriously interrogating me right now?" she said. "After everything I've put up with since you lost your job, I don't need this on top of everything else." I remember standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where she used to hold my hand across the table, and feeling something shift permanently inside me. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and colder. A recognition that the story I'd been telling myself about my marriage might not be the true one. I didn't confront her again after that night. I decided, instead, to actually find out. Oh, because if I was wrong, I needed to know I was wrong before I said another word. And if I was right, I needed proof strong enough that no anger, no clever excuse, no fast-talking could make it disappear. What I found 3 weeks later would end any doubt I had left. And it would reveal exactly who had been standing on the other side of my marriage the entire time. I've built my entire career on one: skill. Following a trail of numbers until they tell the truth, no matter how many people want them to say something else. It turns out that skill works just as well on a marriage as it does on a balance sheet. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't need to. I started with something simple: our joint credit card statement. The one I'd stopped scrutinizing closely once money got tight, and I trusted Natalie to handle the household spending while I focused on rebuilding my income. When I finally sat down and went through 6 months of charges line by line, the pattern jumped out immediately, the way an error always does once you actually look for it. A recurring charge at a small boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city, always on a Thursday, always around lunchtime. A florist charge that didn't correspond to any holiday, birthday, or occasion I could think of. A restaurant I'd never heard of, charged twice a month for exactly 2 entrees and 1 bottle of wine, at a price point well above anywhere we normally ate. I cross-referenced the dates against her late nights at work and her new gym schedule. They lined up, every single one. There's a specific kind of sight that settles over you in that moment. Not shock exactly. Some part of me had been bracing for this since the maintenance log lie. It was more like watching a building you'd lived in your whole life quietly reveal that its foundation had been cracked the entire time, and you simply hadn't been looking down. I still needed to know who. Some cold, methodical part of my brain. The same part that used to trace missing funds through 100 pages of transaction records. Told me I wouldn't be able to move forward, in any direction, without that answer. It came from an unexpected place. Our neighbor, Patricia, an older woman who'd lived on our street for 20 years and noticed everything that happened on it, mentioned to me in passing one afternoon that she'd seen David's car in our driveway a few times when I was supposedly at a contract job across town. She said it casually, the way you mentioned the weather, clearly assuming I already knew my old colleague had been stopping by. David Reyes, the man who had stopped returning my calls the moment my career fell apart. The man whose name made Natalie go quiet in that specific, careful way. It made a horrible kind of sense once I let myself see it. David had watched my downfall from the inside. He knew exactly how vulnerable I'd become. And somewhere in that vulnerability, he had found his opening. I didn't confront anyone yet. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategy. I've learned in my career that confronting someone before you have complete proof only gives them time to build a better lie. But part of it, if I'm being fully truthful, was that I needed to see it myself. I needed to stop reconstructing the betrayal from receipts and secondhand gossip and actually witness it, so no version of Natalie's inevitable explanation could talk me out of what I already knew. So I waited for a Thursday. I told Natalie I had an out-of-town consulting meeting that would keep me overnight. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have a call scheduled, just not one that required travel. I packed an overnight bag in front of her that morning, kissed her goodbye the way I always did, and watched her face carefully as I said it. There was no hesitation in her expression, no flicker of guilt. If anything, I saw something closer to relief. I drove 2 hours away, checked into a motel, made my scheduled call, and then drove straight back that evening, arriving home just after 8. The house was quiet from the outside. Her car was in the driveway. A second car, one I didn't recognize but somehow already knew, was parked just down the block, the way you park when you don't want a car remembered by name. I let myself in through the front door as quietly as I've ever done anything in my life. What I found in our living room, the room where we'd hosted dinner parties, where I'd proposed a second time after the courthouse ceremony because Natalie wanted a real moment, where our wedding photo still sat on the mantel. I won't describe in detail. You don't need the details, and honestly, I've spent enough of my life carrying them. What I'll tell you is this: there was no question left to ask. There was no explanation that could rewrite what I was looking at. Natalie saw me first. Her face went white. She said my name like a question, like she was hoping I might somehow not be real. David didn't even have the composure to speak. He just stood there. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. I felt something stranger. A kind of terrible clarity, like a fog I'd been standing in for over a year had suddenly lifted all at once. I looked at the wedding photo on the mantel. I looked back at both of them. Then I did something neither of them expected. I took out my phone, and I took a single photograph of the room exactly as it was. Natalie started to speak, some half-formed sentence stumbling out of her mouth, some opening move in an explanation I already knew wouldn't hold up to a single fact I now possessed. I didn't let her finish it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything, didn't demand anything, didn't give either of them the confrontation they were probably already bracing for. I turned around, walked back out the front door, and got in my car. I had exactly one thought as I sat in the driveway, hands steady on the wheel in a way that almost frightened me. This wasn't the end of anything. This was the beginning of the only response that would actually matter. Here is something I learned during the worst year of my professional life. The year my name was dragged through an accusation I didn't deserve. The people who win aren't the ones who react the fastest. They're the ones who stay calm long enough to be right. I drove to a hotel that night. I didn't go back inside the house. I didn't answer the 4 calls and 11 texts Natalie sent over the following 2 hours, each one escalating from confusion to panic, to a kind of pleading I might have found convincing a year earlier. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, the same gesture she'd started using against me months earlier. And I let myself think clearly for the first time in a long time. I want to be direct about something, because I know some of you watching are hoping for a version of this story with screaming and broken dishes and a dramatic public scene. That was never going to be me, and honestly, it was never going to be effective. Natalie had spent over a year building a narrative where I was the failure, the man whose career collapsed and dragged their marriage down with it. If I'd shown up screaming that night, I would have handed her exactly the story she needed. An unstable, humiliated husband, easy to paint as the villain, easy to leave. Instead, I decided to do what I do best. I built a case. Over the following weeks, I gathered everything methodically. The way I once traced discrepancies through corporate ledgers for a living. The credit card statements. The photograph from that night, kept privately. Never shared, never leaked, just documented, dated, and secured. Records from Patricia, who agreed, once I explained gently what had happened, to write down what she remembered seeing and when. Bank statements showing Natalie had quietly opened a separate account 8 months earlier and had been funneling a portion of our joint income into it. Money that, under the law in our state, she had no right to hide unilaterally during an intact marriage. I also did something Natalie never saw coming. I finished clearing my name. The financial misconduct case that had destroyed my career was by this point nearly resolved. I had spent over a year cooperating fully with a formal review, providing every document, every email, every piece of evidence proving the missing funds had been misrouted by an error, several levels above my role. An error, as it turned out, connected to a signature that wasn't mine, on paperwork processed during a period when David Reyes had briefly covered adjacent accounts during a staffing gap. I want to be careful here, because I'm not interested in painting a conspiracy where there wasn't one proven. What I can tell you is that the timeline was documented, official, and entirely outside my control, and it was formally confirmed, in writing, by the firm's compliance office, roughly 3 weeks after that night in my living room. I was cleared, fully, publicly, within the industry circles that mattered. My old firm issued a formal correction to my employment record. 2 other companies, aware of the reversal, reached out almost immediately with interest in bringing me on. I said no to both of them. Instead, I used my severance, my savings, and a small loan I qualified for now that my name was clean again, to open my own firm, a boutique forensic accounting practice, specializing in exactly the kind of misrouted funds and buried discrepancies that had once nearly ended me. I named it after nothing sentimental. I named it after precision, because precision was the thing that had saved me. Natalie, during all of this, had no idea how far things had actually progressed. I moved out quietly, into a small apartment across town, telling her only that I needed space to think. I let her believe, because it served the moment and because it was, in its own way, still true, that I was a broken man licking his wounds, uncertain of his next move. She continued living in the house, continued her relationship with David in the open, now that there was no more reason to hide it, and continued telling anyone who'd listen that Marcus Wilson simply couldn't handle failure, that their marriage had ended because I'd become obsessed with proving I wasn't a failure, instead of accepting reality and moving on. I let her say it, every word of it, for months, because the version of me she was describing to our friends, our families, anyone who'd listen, the broken, obsessive, humiliated man, was about to collide directly with a truth she hadn't accounted for. I filed for divorce quietly, through a lawyer who specialized in cases involving hidden assets, presenting the financial cords I'd gathered as evidence of the separate account she'd opened without my knowledge. Under the law, that account and everything funneled into it over those 8 months became part of the marital estate, subject to full disclosure and equitable division. Money she had assumed was safely hers, invisible, untouchable. I also, carefully and through the proper legal channel of discovery rather than any public confrontation, ensured that the photograph and the supporting timeline became part of the formal record, establishing the date our marriage had functionally ended, a detail that mattered enormously for how the assets would ultimately be divided. Natalie's lawyer, I'm told, advised her to settle quickly and quietly once he saw what I had. She didn't listen to that advice. Instead, believing she still held the upper hand, still believing I was the desperate one, she decided to fight the divorce publicly, in front of friends, in front of family, painting herself as the woman who'd stood by a broken man for a year before finally, understandably, moving on. She had no idea the story she was telling was about to be corrected. In a courtroom, in front of everyone who mattered, with documents she couldn't argue with and a version of events she couldn't spin. She had no idea that David Reyes, watching his own career quietly threatened by his name surfacing in financial discovery documents tied to my old firm's misconduct case, was already starting to panic. And she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her in the mediation room 3 weeks later. The mediation room was smaller than I expected. A long table, neutral lighting, the kind of room designed to feel like nothing dramatic could possibly happen inside it. Natalie walked in looking composed, confident even, dressed the way you dress when you believe you're about to win something. I watched her scan the room, clock the folder in front of my lawyer, and clock the calm, unbothered expression on my face. I could see the exact moment her confidence flickered, just slightly, like she was recalculating something she thought she already understood. Her lawyer opened with the story she'd been telling for months. The broken husband, the career collapse, the reasonable, sympathetic wife who had simply moved on after enduring a difficult year. It was a good story. It might have worked, if it had been true, and if it had been the only version of events in the room. Then my lawyer opened the folder. He laid it out cleanly, without theatrics, exactly the way I'd built it. Methodical, documented, undeniable. The separate account, opened 8 months before I ever discovered anything, with deposits that traced directly back to funds diverted from our joint income. Patricia's written statement, dated and notarized, describing a pattern of visits stretching back over a year. The hotel and restaurant charges, cross-referenced against Natalie's claimed work schedule, showing a discrepancy no reasonable person could call coincidence. And finally, presented not as ammunition but simply as fact, the date and circumstances establishing when our marriage had functionally ended, month earlier than Natalie's narrative had ever accounted for. I watched her face while he spoke. I watched the story she'd built for herself and told to everyone who'd listen, quietly come apart in real time. Her lawyer, to his credit, tried to pivot. He argued for a more even split despite the evidence. But the numbers didn't leave much room for argument, and neither did the law in our state once hidden marital assets and a clearly established timeline were on the table. Natalie left that mediation with significantly less than she'd expected, and with a public record that told a very different story than the one she'd been narrating for over a year. But the reckoning didn't stop in that room. Word travels fast in small professional circles, and ours was smaller than most. Within weeks, people who'd heard Natalie's version, the obsessive husband, the broken man who couldn't accept failure, started hearing the corrected one instead. My exoneration at the old firm had already become public knowledge. The timeline from the mediation, filed as part of the public divorce record, filled in the rest. People began to understand, quietly, and without me ever needing to say a single vindictive word, what had actually happened in our marriage and why. David Reyes didn't survive the fallout either, his name surfacing in financial discovery documents connected to my old misconduct case. Documents that, once properly reviewed, made clear his role in the staffing gap where the original error occurred, triggered a review of his own position at his firm. I want to be clear that I never set out to destroy his career. I simply told the truth, with documents to back it, and let the consequences fall where the facts actually pointed. His firm, uncomfortable with the exposure, quietly let him go within 2 months. Shortly after, according to people who still talked to me, he stopped returning Natalie's calls the same way he'd once stopped returning mine. Natalie ended up moving back in with her mother for a period, a fact I learned secondhand and felt, to my own surprise, no satisfaction in hearing. Somewhere in the 2 years it took to build my forensic accounting firm into something respected. Somewhere between the late nights, the careful casework, the slow rebuilding of a reputation from nothing, I had stopped needing her downfall to feel complete. My life simply moved forward, and hers, without the version of me she'd assumed would stay broken forever, didn't. My firm grew steadily. Within 3 years, I was being brought in as an expert consultant on the exact kind of misconduct cases that had once nearly destroyed me. Hired specifically because I understood, better than most, what it looked like when someone's name got attached to a mistake that wasn't theirs. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, Natalie reached out. She'd heard about the firm. She'd heard, I assume, about the life I'd rebuilt while she wasn't watching. She asked to meet, said she wanted to apologize properly, said the affair had happened because she'd been confused, scared, convinced my career, and by extension our future, was permanently over. I agreed to meet her, mostly out of curiosity, and maybe a small, honest part of me wanting to see how she told the story now that the facts had caught up with it. We met at a quiet cafe. She looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. She talked about confusion, about fear, about a year that had scared her more than she'd known how to handle. I let her talk. And then, gently, I mentioned that I'd heard, through mutual friends who still spoke to us both, that she'd already started seeing someone new, someone from her mother's neighborhood, someone she hadn't mentioned once during this entire conversation about reconciliation. She didn't deny it. She just went quiet, the same careful quiet I remembered from years earlier, back when David Reyes's name would come up, and she'd choose every word like it was a landmine. I didn't get angry. I didn't need to anymore. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out a folder I'd brought without fully deciding I would use it, and set it on the table between us. Inside was the final compliance letter from my old firm, the one that had cleared my name in full, dated 3 weeks after that night in our living room. Proof that my career had never actually been the failure she'd built her justification around. You didn't leave because I failed, I told her. You left because you believed I had failed. Those were never the same thing, Natalie. You just never waited long enough to find out. I stood up, left enough money on the table to cover both our coffees, and walked out. I heard, months later, that the man she'd started seeing found out about her pattern of secrecy and left before things got serious. Apparently a mutual friend had, without any involvement from me, simply told him the full story of how our marriage had actually ended. Natalie was left, as far as I know, largely alone, still telling a version of events that fewer and fewer people believed. I don't share any of that with satisfaction. I share it because it's simply what happened. The truth, once it's fully documented and fully told, has a way of settling every account on its own. I never raised my voice. I never sought revenge in the way people usually mean that word. I just refused to let a lie about my life outlive the facts. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone get destroyed. It's watching them finally receive the bill for everything they broke, and realizing there's no one left willing to pay it for them. That's all for today on Cheating Lady Files. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Would you have walked away this calmly?